We've been journeying through the Old Testament together, seeing the journey of God's people as being our faith journey and trying to fall into step with where God might be leading us. So as we find our place to step into this story this morning, I want you to think of the nastiest, meanest, cruelest villains in any story you can remember. Maybe it's Darth Vader followed by a bunch of stormtroopers from Star Wars. Maybe the Dark Lord Saren and his orcs from the Lord of the Rings. The Wicked Witch of the West and her flying monkeys from the Wizard of Oz. That's still my shudder point. Maybe in that thought process throw in some real life villains from our world. The Nazis, ISIS, whatever. Let those images of evil float around in your head, and you have an idea somewhat of what the Assyrian Empire was like. You know, when you think about empires throughout history, you usually don't get warm, fuzzy feelings. But the Assyrian Empire took cruelty and destruction to a new level. As the map shows, they had their roots in what is now northern Iraq. And from there, they were able to conquer most of the Middle East, clear down into Egypt and way up into Turkey. And right in the middle there was Judah and Jerusalem. And as I said, the Assyrians were cruel. You might ask, how cruel? Well, they were so cruel that when the city of Babylon, who at that time was filled with hundreds of thousands of people, when they destroyed Babylon, the destruction was so complete by the Assyrians that it was the equivalent of a nuclear bomb going off. They totally wiped out the city. And the Assyrians created that much destruction with handheld weapons. The Assyrians were bullies. The king's palace in Nineveh, as they discovered in excavations, was covered with carvings and paintings of Assyrians executing and dismembering and enslaving conquered people in the most hideous ways you can imagine. And this artwork was found on the walls of the room where foreign ambassadors were made to sit before going in to see the king of Assyria. These guys were over the top, pushy bullies. And they were greedy. The empire lasted for hundreds of years, and so every few years they'd go out on a campaign fighting and conquering enemies. And it wasn't long before their economy depended on that sort of warfare, so they'd campaign every year. And if they couldn't find enemies to fight every year, they'd simply attack and destroy friendly nations around them. Now, understand that these are the people who are outside of the walls of Jerusalem when our lesson begins. The Assyrian king Sennacherib sent his second in command to have some words with the folks in Jerusalem and their king Hezekiah. The Rabshakeh, as he was called, had come up from Lachish. And Lachish was a city that was fortified so that it could serve as a buffer to protect Jerusalem from attack. So to get to the capital, first you had to go through Lachish. Well, the Assyrians had leveled Lachish. There wasn't a building left standing. The road now was open to Jerusalem. Now again, to put this into some context, had the Confederate Army won the Battle of Gettysburg, there would have been nothing to keep them from marching on to Washington, D.C. You get this sort of an idea of the role that Lachish played. So the Rabshakeh comes to the wall of Jerusalem, and with his brash talk, he begins to get inside the people's heads with doubt and fear. He says, "Where's your God? Your king has no real strength. Look what happened to Lachish. Well, you're next. Your king can't save you. Your God can't save you. We are Assyria, and all nations have fallen before us. You have no hope. So be afraid. Be very afraid." No wonder King Hezekiah and his officials were just a little bit frightened. The bragging that the Assyrian field commander does to the officials listening, that wasn't idle talk today, we might say. No brag, just facts. They could back up all of those words they were speaking by a trail of blood and death and slavery. So you'd have to think awfully long and hard about how wise it would be to go up against this group of thugs in battle. So what you have here is a classic setup between a ruthless bully on the one hand and God's faithful servant on the other. But Hezekiah, even though he's afraid, he doesn't cower or he doesn't bluster back. Instead, he turns to Isaiah the prophet to see what God wants him to do in this situation. And Isaiah encourages the king and his officials to stand fast. He says, the Lord can be trusted, even in the face of these monsters. And as we read the story, the faith of the people has results. When all the dust settles and we come to the end of the story, Hezekiah is still in control. Jerusalem is still standing. Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, has been killed in a palace intrigue back home in Nineveh. And the Assyrian army that's outside the gates of Jerusalem is ravaged by a plague. And they have to return home. And the Bible attributes that to the angel of the Lord at work. Have you ever been faced with a situation or had to deal with a person that came on like the Assyrians? Has your life in those circumstances ever seemed hopeless? Maybe your personal Assyrian empire is not a person at all. Maybe it's a situation, maybe it's an addiction or a compulsion or a habit that you really, really, really need to just leave behind. Or maybe it's a life situation that you just can't get out of. Whatever it is, these verses inspire us to hold on and to always look to the Lord for help. The world is full of voices that are shouting at a high volume saying, be afraid. Be very afraid. And we know that fear-mongering can be an extremely profitable business. Fear can motivate people to do all kinds of things. Fear can motivate people to spend money on things that they don't need. Fear can motivate people to get out and vote or stay home and not vote. Fear can lash out at faceless others called immigrants or Muslims or politicians or whoever you want to pick to fill in that blank. Fear can push you to deal with those people. Fear can cause adults to overwork and kids to overperform. Fear can bring folks together into groups that pit us against them. Tyrants have known for centuries that if you want to control people, all you have to do is make them afraid. Fear is the strongest motivation that humans know, except for love. You see, once fear-mongering gets into our heads, then we tend to do the fear-monger's work for them. Those voices keep saying over and over again, be very afraid. And all of you have lists of things that fill that role for you that you are afraid of. It might be different races or money or jobs or the economy or the school policies or marriage or kids or church or change. We let fear take over and we give in to the belief that our security then lies somewhere else than with God. And worse yet, I think, we throw our hands in the air and we claim that the world is going to hell in a handbasket and there's nothing that we can do about it. But that's not the Christian's view of the world. It's not a witness to faith in the God who has, one, delivered us from bondage and has been faithful to the promises God has made, as we've seen over and over again as we study through the Old Testament. Two, has shown us what true love is in Jesus Christ. And three, has declared that all things will be made new. Giving into fear, as Sennacherib hoped that the Judeans would do, is not a Christian witness, not a way that the Christian takes on the world. Our witness is to a love that casts out all fear. So, what can we take away from this story about fear and faith and trust? Well, one learning is that the voices of fear are crafty. The Assyrian king's messenger speaks in the language of the Hebrew people. He doesn't speak in Assyrian. He wants them to be very clear that they understand every word he's speaking. He intimidates the people by using familiar words. Sometimes the voices of fear try to get inside of our heads, trying to use things or people that we care about the most and play on our emotions. Second, we learn that the loudest voice is often the voice that gets our attention, or to put it another way, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. In Isaiah's story, all the people who line the city wall and listen to the impressive Assyrian delegation pronounce threats, they have their attention riveted on what that man is saying. I think often we are riveted by voices that are crying out to us to be afraid as well. Have you noticed how much shouting you hear on TV news roundtables, or political debates, or in the recent campaign ads, shouts that say, "Don't vote for my opponent, you don't know what will happen, but I can guarantee you it won't be good, so be afraid." Even when we know that God is faithful, the shouting and voices of fear grab our attention, and pretty soon those are the only voices we hear. The call to trust God becomes a distant whisper. And those voices can shape us. Those loud voices can wear us down. Hezekiah and his entourage tore their clothes and they put on sackcloth. And we react that way too. The loud voices shout at us from all sides, from Facebook to cable news to radio talk shows. And soon those voices are viewed as the way that things really are. We let those voices define reality, and we deny the deep, true reality of God's love that's working inside of us and among us at all times. The story teaches us that in the midst of a fear-filled world, that when our voice is tuned into God's voice, when our vision is clearly focused on God, we can make a difference. Hezekiah warned the people ahead of time not to listen to the threats, but to keep their gaze focused on God. God would deliver them, rather than on these bullies outside the walls, no matter how impressive their uniforms were, no matter how strong their armies were. And he turns to Isaiah, and he says, "Isaiah, help me keep my eye on God." We need to bring our focus back to the one who made us. The one who knows our going out and our coming in, as Isaiah writes, who keeps us, who saves us. It is God, we believe, who has the final word. It is God who defines reality, and it is God who offers us love that casts out fear. You know, you read through the story and you wonder where God is going to speak a word here in this whole situation. Well, finally, in the 6th verse of chapter 37, God speaks, and God's first words are, "Don't be afraid." Fear does not disappear when those words are spoken, but the power of bullying and the fear-mongering begins to crack when those words are both spoken and heard. "Do not be afraid" are words of truth in the midst of an ocean of lies, and we are called to share that word with one another and with the world again and again and again. And as we speak that truth of faith and that word that tells us not to fear, we will make a difference. God has a mission for the world that is the polar opposite of fear. In fact, it's in a different frame of reference altogether. The first part of Isaiah's book, he wrote, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God, to the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." Jerusalem's not going to be destroyed, God says. Jerusalem's going to be the source of God's words for us. "He shall judge between nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." Did you catch the shift there? Now God is at the center. Isaiah draws attention away from military power and military might outside the walls of Jerusalem, and he points that attention to the reign of God. Jerusalem is not a people under threat. Instead, Jerusalem is the center of life-giving teaching, flourishing life, the source of life for all people. When our gaze shifts from fear to hope, then trust in God can grow deep roots that sustain life. Like the choir anthem said, love grows here. It begins with that deep faith that God has given to us. You know, we're still waiting to see swords being beaten into plowshares. We're still waiting to see that time coming when nations will no longer learn how to make war, and it almost seems too good to be true. Our world has been filled with violence and destruction for thousands and thousands of years, and you wonder if something like this could actually happen. Even Jesus, the one we call the Prince of Peace, faced violence and was killed by another empire. But the empire that killed him, the Roman Empire, as well as the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Macedonians, Nazi Germany, Communist Russia, empire after empire, they're all now on the trash heap of history. They are no more. But Jesus Christ is still very much alive and with us. Do not be afraid. Let that be your courage when you take on the boys of life. That Christ is alive and with us. Do not be